Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the show. I don't know if it's morning or evening where you are, but happy day. We're going to be talking today about biodiversity and the preservation of biodiversity and just the wildlife generally. And it is a topic that we've talked a bit before about on the show. So we're coming at it from a different angle today. So I'm going to start right up front, welcoming David Goldman to the show. He's from the Foundation of National Parks and Wildlife. We're going to talk a bit about that in a second. But David, welcome to the show. Give us a sense of where you are and where you're coming from, and then we'll dive straight into the subject matter.
Yes, thanks, Vincent, and thanks for having me. I'm situated in Sydney, Australia.
Perfect. And I want to firstly understand something we just touched on before the show in terms of the Foundation for National Parks and Wildlife. It's an organisation that sits adjacent to another government body or something else. I just want to understand that first, and then we'll dive into the subject matter.
Sure. So we were established back in 1970 by the New South Wales state government. We were set up to be the philanthropic arm of the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and we've since expanded that footprint to be the charity arm of all national parks around the country. Our main reason for being back then, and still is now, is to raise money to purchase land that's typically adjacent to national parks so that we can grow the footprint of national parks, and that in itself saves threatened species. So we'll raise the money, we'll identify land with government and understand their various priorities. And then once we've identified that land, purchase the land, hand it back over to that relevant state government. The land gets gazetted through Parliament as national park, and it's then protected in perpetuity.
Got it. Okay. And I want to dive into that whole model in a minute because I've got about 18,000 questions on that, but I want to come back just a step. I want to understand kind of the status of land and kind of biodiversity preservation in Australia more broadly. Like, I mean, I think of, and where I'm coming from with this is I think about kind of I think the oldest national park in the world is in New South Wales. Is that right? Royal National Park? Is it claimed as the oldest, or the oldest in Australia at least?
Well, it could be. We've also got rainforests up in northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland that are 550 million years old.
Oh, okay. In terms of their age. I mean, how long we've been looking, like preserving it as a national forest. But what I guess what I'm trying to understand here is how, like, when we think about kind of natural spaces and national parks as part of that, but land that is definitely not being used for some other usage, right, in terms of logging or mining or whatever it is. Like, what does that look like today in Australia in terms of, 20,000 years ago, how much of it was there? How much of it's there today? Let's understand the problem space first.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Back in December last year at COP15, Australia was one of 196 countries that signed up to a covenant to agree to the 30 by 30, which is basically to protect 30% of the country by 2030.
Right.
Right now, best estimates that we've protected 22% of the country. So we've still got a fair way to go. And I would imagine, that's something that everybody, all of your listeners, would appreciate in terms of we really need to protect the threatened species. The federal government put out a list, continuously update that list. It's part of the EPBC Act. And currently there's almost 2,000 threatened species, both flora and fauna. So we see protected land as the best way to protect species. And we're doing this for the future. We're doing this for the kids. Otherwise, what are we leaving behind, and what are future generations going to be exposed to?
Yeah. And I kind of want to understand it not all just from a kind of opportunity to preserve the, nature in the way it is. I mean, nature is obviously in a constant state of evolution of things, going extinct and being, and evolving. So I don't want to necessarily get into that debate. But what I am interested in is I think there's a link that a lot of people don't fully understand or appreciate between species diversity and preservation of ecologies generally, in terms of if certain species aren't present in an ecology or in an environment, then that environment has the potential to fully break down. Am I understanding that correctly? Because I think that's an important point to land first.
You are understanding that correctly. And I guess the approach that we take is to actually try and eliminate invasive species.
Right.
So there's a number of invasive species, both flora and fauna, and where we grow and protect species, we're looking at natural native species and believe that's the best way forward for a flourishing, positive biodiversity.
And yeah, because that's kind of what I was getting to, was that if it's not enough to simply purchase the land, if it's covered in XYZ invasive species, there's 100 of them, but cane toads is probably the one that comes to mind in Australia for a lot of people, then we still have things that are going to be degrading, that natural land that we've protected. So it's not the end of the journey, right? Simply getting access to the land and purchasing it and stopping it from mining or logging isn't the end of the journey.
No, that's exactly right. So often what our work will involve before even handing it over, the land over as national park, is that revegetation or regeneration of the land. That could include fencing, for example. Quite often it will include eliminating the invasive weed that pervades on that land, because that's the best way for the native species to be able to flourish. So there's a lot of work to be done before we even hand back the land to the government to gazette it through Parliament. Yeah,
and I'm going to come back to that gazetted word, because I haven't heard that word in decades and I love it. Reminds me of something from like the 1920s, so I want to understand that process a little bit. But I kind of also am curious, like, just in terms of the quantum of this. So when someone says 22% needs to get to 30%, 8% of Australia's land mass, I'm assuming it's based on land mass, is an inordinate amount of land. Like it's a huge, huge amount of land. If there was an invasive species, flora, fauna, like practically speaking, how do you even try to tackle that on such massive scale of problem?
Yeah. So mostly we're working with the National Parks and Wildlife Services around the country. They're the on-the-ground foot soldiers, if you like. We also at the Foundation for National Parks and Wildlife, we've set up a wonderful, I guess, model of utilising volunteers as well and local community nurseries. And often what we do is we get those volunteers, or the National Parks and Wildlife Services will get volunteers going out and eliminating the invasive species, particularly flora, pulling out huge amounts of different lantana, for example, is one of the worst and most pervasive of the invasive species. So we've got a great system there to prepare the land so that the native species can actually thrive.
Got it. Wonderful. And before we dive into some of your model and how that plays, because you've kind of touched on it there, and I want to dive into that and get back to that gazetted word as well. I want to understand, you talked about, the foundation was essentially set up in the 70s. And so there's been a 50-year arc of history here. And, from yourself and from the organisation more broadly, what's changed in terms of people's attitudes and awareness in that time? How does this now look versus, say, 50 years ago?
Yeah, I think we're living in a much better time. And that could be even over the last couple of years. I think for a long time, and I don't particularly want to get into the debate, but for a long time, human-induced climate change, there were the skeptics and there were the deniers. But what we can't deny are the extreme weather events that are happening. The floods, the fires, the bushfires, the Black Summer bushfires of 2019, 2020. We can't deny that and the impact that that's having on our country. I think they're the challenges that we're facing. And for example, at FMPW, we've got some projects looking into what could be the native shrub, the native tree that could make your property or could make national parks or corridors of national parks more resilient to fire. What type of trees do we need to be planting in riverbanks to stem the tide and the flow of the water that a town might be downstream, and to protect the town downstream? So there's a lot of work to be done to build the resilience back into the landscape to counter the extreme weather events that we're seeing.
Yeah. And I was kind of wanted to ask that at one point as well, but you've got us there already, which is there's land preservation for the benefit of preserving biodiversity and just the land generally for the appreciation and use of that land in a non kind of extractive sense and not a mining or a logging sense or whatever the other options are. But there's also, if you take the natural land and preserve it, say through to 30% in Australia, I mean, that sounds like at a global scale, but Australia is a microcosm, is a huge lever for trying to offset or address some of the things that are causing some of those problems in the first place. Is that part of how this plays out as well, which is if we can protect these large bodies of land and regenerate them, where actually it's a massive lever for offsetting the problem in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. So in most instances, regeneration of land includes the planting of trees. So you've obviously got carbon sequestration happening there. You're looking at, I guess, a better ecosystem to help with the purification of water and soil degradation. So the land is just going to be much more healthy. And that's why we use the word resilience. We're trying to build resilience back into the landscape so that the land just keeps on regenerating and we as humans don't have to do very much. It will just be there and be able to protect itself in effect.
Yeah, and I'm curious about it because I think there's this kind of not trite, probably too strong a word, but hey, let's just go and plant a bunch of trees, right? And you end up with this monoculture approach to sticking a bunch of things that do sequester carbon and then do produce, oxygen and, tick a bunch of boxes from, hey, we planted 1 billion trees and, people will often engage with forms of commerce that say, hey, when you did this thing, we planted a tree. But the level down from this, which is kind of what you're more referring to, is that if that tree is operating in isolation from its broader ecosystem, then it's missing the wood for the trees, if you pardon that very appalling use of the pun. But there is a whole bunch of ecosystem that has to live around that tree for that to actually work and have any kind of ongoing effect, because the tree, isn't an island out there. It has to actually be part of a row of shrubs and then animals that are eating and foraging that are then, leaving poo or whatever else that's going on. So that whole thing not working together means that you're actually ultimately not really building any kind of long-term sustainable solution. Am I making that leap correctly?
Yeah, I think you are, absolutely. And let's also not forget that if we've got a thriving natural ecosystem, that's good for us as humans as well, because we are purifying the air, we are purifying the waters, the soil in which the product that we're growing and eating from is of better quality. So whilst we're very, very focused on natural ecosystems, I think the spin-off effect is the benefit that we have as humans as well. And the interaction between those two ecosystems can only happen if both are thriving and are in a positive state of biodiversity.
It's a really interesting point. And I think what I'm always trying to do is to zoom out to the global and zoom in to the individual, because I think a lot of people will, and I'm going to give you an example of my own. A lot of people will battle with, well, this is such a huge challenge. What could I possibly do? What difference could I possibly make? And you sort of have to get individuals and maybe organizations as well, but like operating at the individual level to reflect on the opportunity for you as an individual to reduce whatever it is that you're doing. So take my example at home. We spoke to the Saudi Alan from Subpod, and I put a Subpod in about 6 months ago, and 80% of my waste is the compost from fresh fruit and veg that goes into that. There's very little. There's some soft plastics. But my actual rubbish waste is now about less than a normal shopping bag about once every 2 weeks. So clearly in your own kind of local environment, you can make those changes. But I'm trying to, in terms of someone saying, well, what else can I be doing? I want to understand kind of the leverage that someone might get by contributing on a regular basis, $30 a month or whatever it is, to help buy back land. Like, help me understand that leverage that they actually apply by doing something like that.
Yeah. So I guess direct contributions to our foundation will go to either purchasing land and, protecting land, protecting species in perpetuity, or we have a large bushfire recovery program, which was born out of the Black Summer bushfires. We actually established now 18 local community nurseries, soon to be 24. And each of those nurseries are producing local provenance trees sourcing local provenance seed so that they've got every opportunity to grow and to thrive in that local area. And then they are planted back into the bushfire affected areas, which sadly for northern New South Wales were flood affected areas as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think if it comes back to the individual, tying it back to the individual, we'd like to look at our own backyards and then think that there are natural green corridors out towards national parks.
Mm-hmm.
And animals can only roam freely or safely through those natural green corridors. So for us as individuals to be doing our part, we could plant trees, we could do a number of things in our own backyard that lead to a bigger, broader, greener corridor that will provide safety for the animals to roam freely back to national park as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And because I'm kind of curious about this connection and you talked about it right up front, but there's the land that is already national forest and it's, essentially owned, gazetted to the government, definitely getting back to that gazette word. But then what you're looking to do is to buy land, and you mentioned being ideally adjacent to this land, basically expanding that land and then ultimately handing it back so that the national park actually becomes bigger. And I guess the thing that I'm curious about is, like, let's say someone pays $30 a month to yourselves or donates $30 a month as a charity. Like, and say it's being used to purchase land, so just ignoring the bushfire aspect for the moment. Like, tell me how that kind of plays out, because it's $30 a month is, $360 a year. Realistically, if you have that subscription for 10 years, how much land are you helping to purchase that will then be owned in perpetuity, that then if 10,000 people do that or if 100,000 people do that, here's what the magnum is? I'm trying to understand the enumeration of this.
Yeah, it's a bit of a difficult question to answer, mostly because land prices around the country are going to vary and be very different. The model, I guess, that we work to is that we'll work with each of the state governments. They'll have their own priorities. They'll identify those priorities for us, and there'll be different blocks of land. And depending on the price of the land, we'll be able to help them purchase that or purchase it ourselves. So I don't mean to evade the question, but it's how long is a piece of string in terms of what's the value of the land and how much can we really buy back?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that it could be understood is if the organisation's been around for 50 years and it's taken in a certain amount of donations, you would know how much land has been bought with the help of the organisation over the last 50 years. Kind of gives us a sense of the scale of just what's possible with the organisation.
Yeah. Look, one example is in 2020, we were able to contribute with the South Australian government to purchase some land at the Nilpena Ediacara National Park. I think we purchased 60,000 hectares, which is a huge volume of land, probably the equivalent to close to 120,000 soccer pitches. That's, on one scale, we've got that. Last year, we purchased 189 hectares up in the Gondwanan rainforest. And again, that's probably the equivalent of 450 soccer pitches. So the size can vary, but the ecological importance of the land is also what we're looking at. If the land is barren and has no real opportunity to be revegetated or regrown, we probably won't look at it. Rainforest is a great space because the trees will thrive there and grow very, very quickly, and we can begin to benefit. We can begin to see the signs of positive biodiversity very, very quickly. So I think that's where government begin to prioritise the land and where they need help. It's what impact are we really going to have?
Yeah, and I'm curious about this, and I don't mean this question in a kind of a needling way, but there is obviously a really strong relationship. I mean, you're born out of a federal state government initially, but obviously tied into federal government generally. And you just mentioned the state governments typically will say, here's a tract of land that we're looking at that we think is important, and will then work closely with you to work out how to gather the funds to raise that, often in conjunction with and find it. Just help me understand how that works.
Yeah, it's a case-by-case example where typically government will ask them to tip in at a ratio of about 3 to 1.
Right.
So for every dollar that we're going to raise, hopefully they put in $3. And we're talking about multi-million-dollar purchases, and that's a lot of fundraising. So we do rely on the support of government, and they have provided that support over the years. So yeah, it's a partnership, I think, that works well for everyone.
Yeah, I think the reason why I come into it is that I didn't want to presuppose that the government was contributing or part contributing in a lot of cases, or in some cases. But what has, in my travels in learning about behavioural economics, is that individuals are far more motivated to take an action when there's some other commensurate action being taken by someone else, where it's like someone does dollar for dollar matching. People are like, well, I'm going to put $1 in because I'm actually putting $2 in because someone else will put in $1 if I do. Is there visibility to that matching when you go out and say, hey, we're going to try to buy this $60,000 worth, 60,000 hectares of land, and the government is going to be co-contributing 3-1? Does that connectivity and visibility exist, or?
We don't typically talk of that. No, I think that's sort of more the behind the scenes negotiation that, we're working with the government to enact.
Yeah. I'm curious about that, but there's obviously some more to understand. Help me understand this procedural thing around gazetting. I don't want to, get past it. Just help me understand exactly what's happening. You're working with the government to raise the money, you buy it on behalf of the foundation and then transition it to them over time. Just help me understand that process.
Yeah, so I must state I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure that I could give you the full definition. But yeah, it basically in round terms, we're purchasing land from private land owners. We are set up as a trust, so we can hold that land in trust. And while we hold that land in trust, we're often working on it. So we're revegetating, or we're putting some fences around it, often putting trees, planting trees, etc. So we're giving that land every chance to succeed. And then at a point in time where we think we can hand that land back over, we'll hand that land back over to the state government. As I said, the land is gazetted in Parliament, so it's a process through Parliament that the land ownership transfers from us back to the state government, in which case it's protected in perpetuity.
Got it. So it's essentially a formal legal structure that says, hey, this stuff can't be sold again by a future government because they, got their budget wrong that year and just wanted to kind of to make that work. So it's pretty watertight in terms of someone knows that if they're contributing, they're actually contributing to it ultimately ending up in perpetuity. I think that's really powerful because I think there's a lot of, you ideally what you want, and I think microloans have had such an impact for a similar reason. You want the capital that is contributed via the charity to be able to have some ongoing renewable effect. If you buy someone lunch because they're hungry, absolutely they need to eat. But if you give them the means to employment that allows them to earn money to continue to feed themselves, it's obviously a far better, longer term solution. And I think you're kind of playing off that. I want to understand one of the programs that you kind of touched on, but you didn't mention it directly, which you titled Backyard Buddies. Help me understand this program, because it feels to me like the evolution of the foundation has been from, hey, give us some money, we'll go and buy this stuff, to actually we need to regenerate this stuff, so we have to have services, to, you know what, if you really want to get hands-on and understand why this is important, then we're going to help you with that connection. So help me understand that evolution, and specifically about the Backyard Buddies program.
Yeah, well, the Backyard Buddies program was set up basically as a resource for individuals to understand and learn a little bit more about the environment. It's all about what can you do in your own backyard, and then understanding that connection between your backyard and national parks. So there's a great amount of information that parents or grandparents can share with their kids. We've got things like, what it takes to grow a tree, how to build a bird box, a number of different things, because people have different ecology in their own backyard. So if they go to the site, they can have a look at and potentially work through what some of the challenges they might have in their own backyard, and then understand how that's going to benefit the bigger, broader native ecosystem.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. I think there's so little that is understood by people about the thing that, for me personally, just literally right out that door in terms of what's going on out there and how much of that is, or what role it plays in the broader ecosystem in which it's placed. Even when you're in a suburban place, and Sydney, for all its, green areas, is still, a highly suburban area. I actually want to check on one thing that you talked about in terms of corridors. Is the suggestion there that there is tracts of land that would connect suburban areas of, say, Sydney as an example, where we both are, through to actual national forest and state forest, and it's sometimes about trying to work out how to better preserve those or connect those?
Yes, no, that's exactly right. And they can often be private land holdings as well, in which case, again, not being the lawyer, you can put a Conservation Act on your own land, and that will give it as much protection as creating a national park will give. So if you just simply consider 2 national parks and a green corridor between those 2 national parks, there could be highways. I've seen examples where we tried to build a natural sort of ecosystem over a bridge to ensure that the animals will actually, migrate from one side of the road to the other side of the road rather than, going through the road. But there are natural corridors between parks. And again, that could be privately owned land. It could be other parks. It could be big highways that we want the animals to navigate around or over safely.
Mm-hmm. And just the private landowners thing is interesting to me, because if your aim is to purchase large tracts of land, you're purchasing them from someone. Like who owns all this land? If you had to get that other 8%, who are you buying it from?
It is private landowners. Yeah. There are some very, very large private landowners, particularly adjacent to existing national parks. Often that's land that's been used for farming in previous years. Yeah. So if we have a system where if there are individuals who would like to put some sort of Conservation Act on their land because they want to ensure that, when they leave that land, it's protected, we can work with them to ensure that happens.
Yeah. And I guess the thing that I'm curious about is they purely in an economic sense have bought the land at some point. It's been in a family for probably hundreds of years, more likely, for those larger blocks of land. And they have ownership of the land and stewardship of the land on the basis that it is a productive asset. It's doing something for them economically, I'm just talking. And the dialogue with them to say, well, we would like to take that land and preserve it and stop trying to do that productive thing necessarily, but have other productive uses of the asset in terms of tourism or, biodiversity and the other. Like, how does that kind of dialogue play out? It feels to me like that's a big part of the challenge here. If you can have a bucket of money and someone says, sure, but I run this massively profitable farm on this thing, so that's what you're buying, not the land. How does that play out?
We're not typically buying the massively profitable farms. Often people are bequeathing us the land, and in which case we can, again, hold it in trust. We can actually issue a tax-deductible gift receipt to the estate, which can be quite beneficial. The ATO will just value up the land and we're able to issue a tax receipt to the estate. But for example, I spoke to an elder lady last year who was in WA, had a large piece of land, and she wanted to ensure she wasn't going to be handing it back down to any future generations, but she wanted to ensure that when she left this world, that her land was not going to be bulldozed or be turned into high-rise apartments. So she was interested in talking to us about either putting a Conservation Act on the land and potentially subdividing it so that she could live on part of that, or bequeathing it to us when she passed.
Yeah, it's I think about kind of my own relationship with this in terms of the charities that I support. They are in this vein of how do you preserve the land, but also if you have someone who is a large landowner, clearly lobbying is the wrong word, but building relationships with these people to understand what their motivations are and help them understand that they can even do something like this in their lifetime or beyond their lifetime, as you just mentioned, feels like a big part of the lever. So just coming back a little bit to the foundation itself, and something that I asked right up front before we jumped on the show, like who's typically, and you gave a broad range, but who's typically the type of organisation or individual who is contributing financially to the foundation, and how does that typically play out? What does that look like?
Yeah, so a lot of the work we do is with individual donors who clearly care for the land and have a motivation to, I think, leave the world a better place than what they found it. We work with them. We work with a number of major donors. We have a number of corporate partnerships as well that are wanting to contribute to the positive biodiversity of Australia. And we work also with other trusts and foundations to secure income and government. So we have a very clever model in which most of the money that comes to us, so 87% of the money that comes to us, we will put it back into the purpose. So we quite fastidiously run a very tight ship ourselves. We are the glue that holds a lot of this together. And being the trusted partner of government, they will allocate us money to get a project done. We'll project manage it, but we won't do the work on the ground. We're the ones that will economically find the best subcontractors, etc. So what that means is that when people are donating to us or, want to become a donor, they can be assured that most of the money that they're giving is going to the purpose. And we very stringently sort of operate by those principles.
Yeah. No, I think it's a fascinating model. I think there's and I only did, a limited amount of, I would say, desktop research and trying to understand the space. And the one of the questions I always have around this is if there's multiple parties who are working to achieve the same sorts of outcomes, are we better off having multiple groups or having, bigger groups that are run more efficiently? Maybe that's a false question or, false equivalence. But as someone who's coming into the space thinking, I've got $30 a month to try to, and I'd like to put it to work, understanding, well, this organization is run very well and 27 of that $30 is actually going to get to, the act of it. And that $27 has this type of impact. Is that part of kind of the education that you're having to take people on and to get them from I'm interested, I want to help to this is the one for me?
Yeah, absolutely. And the key word there is impact. And we're all about impact. We're all about measuring our impact. We align our work to, say, for example, the United Nations SDGs. So, at a higher, we are governed in a way that we ensure that every dollar we're looking at is not wasted, but every dollar is invested in that right way. And yeah, the measurement has become more and more interesting over the last couple of years, and there's some very good ways in which we can actually work with third-party verifiers of the work that we're doing and provide almost a set of green accounts to demonstrate where corporates, for example, where their money is going. And they love that because they know that they're not just giving us a bunch of money and it could be going anywhere. We're actually providing third-party verified data to suggest this is the impact that your money is having.
Yeah, I just think, and the more I hear from you today about this, there's you kind of want to borrow from the best of both worlds. There is opportunity to, the governance that government provides can actually be incredibly valuable for building the relevant trust for someone to say, I know this thing's run well. Government in effect, well-run government anyway, is a brand as much as anything, which conveys trust. But the other things that we tend to associate with government in terms of bureaucracy and slow moving and, inefficiency, if you can be one step removed from government and how you actually operate day to day, you kind of get the best of both worlds, and I think, put it this way, if someone might turn around and playing devil's advocate and say, well, I pay tax, why don't they just use my tax dollars to buy the land and then we're done with it? Ignoring that the amount of your tax dollars that would end up going to buying land would probably be less if it went through a government function as opposed to an organisation like yourselves. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say because the running costs, the operating costs of our model, I think would be significantly less than government. We don't have the bureaucracy and the layers that government have, but it also works. It works for government. And I'll give you an example. At the time of the bushfires, we had government tend to operate on tenders and, probably have to get 3 or 4 different quotes, etc. But at the time of the bushfires, we didn't have money. We didn't have the time, to do that. So government trusted us to give us the money to spend on things like training people that were turning up, wildlife rescuers that were turning up to want to help rescue the animals. They gave us money to, provide water, PPE, the fuel required, etc. So in that crisis sort of situation, we're the trusted partner of government. We actually hold the money in our balance sheet. We don't release it to the P&L until it's spent. And then obviously we have to show quite transparently where the money is spent. But we are more efficient, and we can release that money when needed much more quickly than other organizations can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a fascinating kind of system idea generally, which is how do you make the fringes of government in areas where you need on-the-ground local knowledge with continuity and connection into the resources and people and landholders in this case, and the advantages of having government, but then also not tied to slow decision-making, death by committee, whatever, all the other things that we tend to associate with government. It's almost a distributed form of governance in some ways. I just wonder what else we could apply that model to beyond simply the stewardship and the improvement of the land. Probably just one last question from me. And I'm curious, always looking forward at this part of the show, like where to from here with yourselves in terms of you've got backyard buddies, you're buying land, you're also helping with the regeneration of land. Is it about just dialing all of that up and that's really the big lever right now? Is that what you guys are focused on? If we came out a year from now and wanted to talk about what would success kind of look like?
Look, it's dialing it up, but it's also understanding what our long-term sustainable future is.
Sure.
And we're quite realistic in that the pressures on all of us are very, very real, and the donor dollar is drying up. So for us to be sustainable for the future, we have to figure out different revenue models in order to fund the work that we're doing. And what we'll do is we'll develop models that will tie into and motivate government. So, for example, what I talked about with the federal government and their 30 by 30 target by 20, we can develop models around, for example, carbon sequestration that we could use to accrue the carbon credits to pay for the work that we're doing, potentially sell off some of those carbon credits as offsets to corporations to fund the purchase of more land, which we would buy, protect, create national park, which hence, feeds into the federal government's 30 by 30 achievement. So it's about being a bit more clever in how we look at our future and what revenue models we put in place to ensure that we are sustainable. Because I personally, and I'm sure there are a number of people at the office, don't believe that the donor model is necessarily the long-term sustainable future.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think there's so much distrust in kind of models like the ones that you spoke about. And if you're actually coming from a place of having 50 years plus history and delivering on these programs and essentially trusted by the government, I mean, you are in the way that you've described it, if there is programs that require an organisation like a corporate to know that what they're buying, say they're buying a carbon credit of some sort, is actually from net creation of new habitat and, therefore actual carbon offset as opposed to buying something that already exists that we preserved. You're incredibly well positioned to take advantage of that. That's a really interesting way to finish. Well, in the short term, anyone? Yeah, sorry, David, please.
No, I was just going to say on top of that, if corporations are looking to buy into that model, they're also purchasing offsets domestically, and they're not purchasing them offshore, which I think for any large multinational Australian company, they should be looking at.
Yeah, I mean, why not start in your own backyard, as I think you said right up front. Well, David, thank you for coming onto the show today. There's some real actionable stuff there for anyone who's listening to that. And if you're unsure as to what else you might be able to do in an Australian context for preservation of our natural resources, then I would absolutely suggest go and check out the Foundation for National Parks and Wildlife. And obviously you can reach out to the team there if you've got more specific questions as an individual or as a company or as a corporate or as a foundation or any of those things. But David, thank you again for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure, Vincent. And thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.